You know when you just know? You get a feeling, and it's not based on reason or logic or planning. It's just the sense you have in your body. What is that? Is that a gut instinct? Is that intuition? Do you make a distinction between those two things? Do you want to know how? Hi, I'm Sara Russell. I'm a relationship coach, dancer, and Taoist. In every episode, I'll be talking about psychedelics, well-being, and the human experience. And this one is on instinct versus intuition. So I was coming out of a Monday night dance class, and I checked my phone, and I had a missed call from my stepmom. Now, my stepmom and I have a great relationship. She's the one that taught me how to French braid my hair when I was a little girl. And every time I go to visit her and my dad, she vacuums every square inch of their house to get rid of all of the cat hair because she knows I'm horribly allergic to the cats they have. So she takes care of me. But we don't talk on the phone. She doesn't call me. In fact, she had never called me before. And so when I saw her name on my phone, I had this sinking in my stomach and my body went cold and I had this rushing sensation in my head and I started to mildly dissociate. Sound got real fuzzy. My vision got a little blurry and unfocused. And as I'm calling her back and it's ringing, I just know that something's wrong with my dad. And sure enough, she answers the phone. She's a little teary and my dad is unconscious in the hospital. And she's reassuring, but it was scary. Spoiler alert, he totally made it out fine. He has this zest for life because he's here and thriving. And I got to tell you, his sense of humor really ramped up after that. My dad was always a funny guy, but he has a lot to laugh about now, which I super appreciate. But that feeling that I had when I checked my phone and I saw my stepmom's name on my phone and I knew something was going on with my dad, would you say that was instinct or is that intuition? And you might be wondering why I'm even making a distinction between those two things. But for me, it's really important because I believe that instinct is based on the past, whereas intuition is some kind of hope for a different future, some kind of information for a different future. So if we're coming from instinct, that means, according to my definition, we're making choices that are the same choices we've made before, which means we're going to keep recreating the same kind of responses and reactions and circumstances and context. Versus intuition, if we're listening to that voice, and you know that voice that I'm talking about, where it's this kind of quiet, insistent, maybe you should do this, maybe you shouldn't do that. And you know it might cause you some discomfort if you listen to that voice because it might shake things up or it might push you outside of your comfort zone because it's this ability to possibly create a different future. So rather than recreating the past, we're creating a different future if we're making that distinction between instinct and intuition. So I'll define what I mean when I'm talking about instinct first. And basically, I'm talking about how our biology interacts with our experiences. So instinct is the internal experience we're having to an external circumstance. And intuitive responses are lightning fast. Like there's no time for consideration, right? We're just reacting to whatever's happening in the moment. And part of that is because I think our instinct is based on our safety and survival responses. So something happens outside of our body reacts to it, and then we have a set of behaviors that we then acquire in order to respond to whatever those external stimuli are. So what happens is we gather information from our five senses, right? Something happens in the environment and we interpret it through our five senses. So you see something, you hear something, you smell something, you touch something, you taste something, and it kicks off some kind of response in your body. That response is going to be filtered through your limbic system, which we know stores emotions, and the reptilian part of our brain, which is all your automatic responses, right? And so your survival response is going to be fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or dissociate. I know the fight, flight, freeze are the ones people are most familiar with. Fawn is starting to gain some traction, right? That kind of tend and befriend, caretaking impulse when we feel some kind of danger. And then Skills for Change also has this fifth one, which is dissociate. One of my primary survival responses is high functioning dissociation. I shut off from my emotions. I'm not super tracking any pain in my body, and I become highly effective in, let's say, a crisis, right? Because I'm not thinking about how I feel or worried about, sensations or emotions. I'm just acting. So fight, flight, freeze, fawn, dissociate are the five potential safety responses you could be having. And that's going to kick off adrenaline cascading through your body, or holding your breath, or shaking, or sweating, or like that temperature change that I described when I looked at my phone when my stepmom called. And part of what's happening is our safety response is also cueing us into, I like it, I don't like it, I want it, I don't want it. So there's this like really rapid gathering information that's happening, and then we're reacting pretty impulsively, right? And our safety responses are analyzing the past as a way to predict the future, because there was some way we responded in the past that kept us safe, or kept us alive at least. And so then our body goes, well, that worked really well. We're going to keep doing that every single time we're in any kind of situation that even remotely resembles that. Now, what about intuition? And I have to tell you that when I went looking for an agreed upon definition of intuition, I couldn't find one, because when we think about intuition, isn't it this kind of like vague sense in your body? It might feel a little like abstract or esoteric. Yeah. Well, like go through Google or, DuckDuckGo if you're not a Google user, and try to find people who agree on what intuition is. So I went through some of my favorite experts. I started with author Malcolm Gladwell. And Gladwell says about intuition that, quote, a tremendous amount of expertise resides in the unconscious mind. These aren't things we can necessarily describe, explain, or map out. It's a steady accumulation of knowledge that lies below the surface and comes out in the form of intuition. This is one thing that distinguishes experts from non-experts. As the mind stores unconscious expertise, we become more sophisticated. Anyone juggling many different variables, dealing with the incredibly new and complex issues, managing all kinds of different personalities has to, at some point, rely on this body of submerged knowledge to make sense of their tasks. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I slightly disagree with Malcolm Gladwell, who I love and admire and respect and just can't get enough of. And yet, I'm going to say, I actually think that sounds more like instinct to me, in my definition of it, in my worldview. And bless Malcolm Gladwell, I know he has so much spaciousness in his body to hold multiple worldviews and complexity, so I'm just going to go ahead and say that I slightly disagree. I also went to psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who you've heard me talk about on this podcast before, and his idea of system 1 and system 2 thinking, where system 1 is that super fast, you don't think about it, automatic, habituated default responses, whereas system 2 is more of that complex, take it a little slower, hold all the different nuances and competing truths. So we have this idea that we want things to be fast and really clear, right? Like we want easy, fast, clear, definitive answers. We want to know. We want to be sure. And in order to hold all of the different ways that we know things, so what our mind knows, what our heart knows, what our body knows, what our spirit knows, the kind of information we need to hold, not just within ourselves, but across relationships, that takes time. That's not something that can necessarily be rushed. And so, yeah, like instinct is really great. Instinct, that kind of fast automatic response. If somebody slams on the brakes in front of you, you want to be able to hit the brakes in your car without being like, I wonder like when I should hit the brakes and how hard I should hit them. Like you just want to do it. But intuition, right? Like for me, it's the slower, it's this quieter, holding these multiple ways of knowing. It's not quite as efficient in the short term, although I would say that it actually produces sustainable, satisfying results if you can listen to it in a way that has spaciousness. And I'll get to that, what I mean about that a little bit later. Okay, so when I'm talking about intuition, I want to be transparent that I do not identify as a materialist, right? I have my spiritual practices. And whereas instinct feels very concrete, very material, intuition feels a little bit more meta. It feels like with intuition, there's something more. And so how do you tap into that something more, right? So Joe Dispenza talks about the field of energy. There's psychic knowing. There are the conversations you can be having with your ancestors. There are all these different ways of knowing. And, you know, one of the things that instinct and intuition have in common is there may be some kind of pattern recognition. So, how is it that you're recognizing patterns? What patterns are you paying attention to? How do you know what you know? How do you listen to your knowing, and how do you build trust in the way that you know things? My experience with this is that instinct is hard to ignore, like it really asserts itself. And intuition, it's kind of easy to let it just like keep whispering to you, and you're like, yeah, like I don't feel like doing that right now, or yeah, like that just feels too hard. It's kind of easy to ignore. Eventually, like, you know, those of us that have had intuitive hits that have come knocking on the door nice and loud also know that it can start to assert itself. So again, like, you know, all of this is in the shade of gray zone. Something else that instinct and intuition have in common is there may be pieces of pressure inside instinct and intuition. This idea that we should do something, or there's a right move, or there's a right belief, there's a good way to do something, there's a bad way to do something. And so just recognize that internal oppression can creep into both instinct and intuition if you haven't cleared out all of your shame and blame stories about yourselves and other people. So it feels like it's really important to make sure that you're keeping those channels clear so that the information coming through is coming through a clear filter and not one of cultural injunctions, oppression, shame, blame. Something else I do want to mention. So when I was looking up definitions of intuition, I went to my teacher, Nancy Shanto, who's the lineage holder of Skills for Change. And I said, hey, look, like it just seems like a lot of people have a lot of different interpretations of intuition. What's your take on it? And something that she mentioned that I think is pretty critically important is that people can get some victim power from intuition. It's this idea where, as she says, people can use intuition to try to force outcomes in other people's lives. This idea of like, oh, I just have this intuition, you should or you shouldn't do something, as a way to try to power play or control somebody else. And really being able to recognize that, yes, intuition is important, and yes, it's a great thing to listen to, but it's not like the end all be all that we need to bow to, like forsaking all of the other ways that we have of knowing. And that if somebody's getting an intuitive hit and they're sharing it with you, first of all, please get consent before you just share your intuitive hits about somebody. See if they want the information that you have. Consent. But also recognizing that we get to decide our unique relationship with those we're willing to trust, what we're willing to do and what we're not willing to do, and having those come from our values and our sense of being centered and grounded and our practices and our skill sets, rather than just being led around because you're having an intuitive hit or somebody else is having an intuitive hit. So I don't want to uplift intuition to the point where we're disregarding all of the other ways that we have of knowing. So again, instinct feels more like a reaction. Intuition feels more like an insight. Instinct feels really fast. Intuition maybe moves a little bit slower, although both can come with their own various kinds of discomfort. So how do you make a distinction in your body? How do you tell, right? Because like I'm saying, when I'm having, let's say, an instinctual response to something that's triggering in a negative way, I have that drop in my gut. I get a flush of cold. I get that tunnel vision up by my head. I'm located in my third eye. I'm not in my back body at all anymore. And my senses start getting really faded and fuzzy. That's how I know I'm having an instinctual response. How I know I'm having an intuitive response, it's a little bit more back in my body. I feel a little bit floatier in my head. It feels a little bit quieter. Robert Peng actually used this phrase when he was teaching me a Qigong exercise. And he was saying that it's like listening to a sound that's far off. And he wasn't using that to describe intuition. He was talking about like having some kind of centered attention training practice. But like intuition feels a little bit like listening to a sound that's far off. So that's how I can tell in my body. How do you know which one is which in your body? So where is instinct located in your body? Where do you feel it? Where does it fire off? Same question for intuition. Where is that located? Where does that live in your body? And what's the various speeds of your instinct versus your intuition? Is there a difference there? Can you tell? And then asking yourself the question, does the feeling that I have in my body, does this feel like I'm reacting to something in the past, something I've already experienced? Does this feel like a historical response? Or does this feel like a present experience that I'm having, a novel experience I'm having, or an experience that I would like to create, some kind of difference I would like to create for the future? So there's this tribe, the Himba tribe, and they don't make a distinction between the colors green and blue the way that we do, but they have this ability to see all of these different shades of what we call green. And this ability to make a distinction between our instinct and our intuition feels to me a little bit like, can we tell the difference between shades of green? Do we tell the difference between blue and green? Because this ability to train our awareness, to notice what we're noticing, expands our consciousness in some way, right? So we know that our consciousness shapes our world, and we have the ability to shape our consciousness. So by training these distinctions, being able to train, being able to see different colors, being able to train, being able to feel the difference between instinct and intuition in our body, cultivates more awareness. The more awareness we have, the more possibility for choice that we have. And when we have more possibility for choice, we actually start getting to design lives of satisfaction rather than just habit. Thanks so much for listening. If you would like more information, you can find me on Instagram at Be The Radical Way. And you can check out trendswithbenefits.com for all of our written work on psychedelics, well-being, and the human experience. Happy exploring.